And tell me why you feel that way. I don't know. I guess I just feel like I'm too broken. Like there's just not even a point in trying to fix everything. Oh my God. Okay, it sounds like you just need to find a new therapist who will give you the borderline diagnosis that you so clearly want. This is a recreation of a very real and very painful experience I had with a therapist a couple of years ago. Therapy is supposed to help, but sometimes it can do just as much harm as good. And today I'm gonna share with you my top 5 therapy horror stories. 5 experiences that I'm probably going to remember forever because they are experiences where I was seeking help and I was harmed instead. Hi there, my name is Megan and I've been in therapy for over a decade now. I've had some amazing experiences and I've had some not so amazing experiences. Today I'm going to share with you 5 of the not so amazing experiences, starting with a therapist that we're going to nickname Tina. In many ways, I'm still really grateful for Tina, even though things went very sideways. She was the first therapist to recognize that I did not have bipolar disorder. She was the first therapist to start working with me on my trauma, something that all of my previous therapists had completely ignored. She was also the first therapist who totally spotted my ADHD, even though I completely blew her off and we never addressed it. Sorry, Tina. So there were a lot of really good things about this therapist, but the problem was, even though she was aware that I had trauma, she wasn't always great at dealing with the signs and symptoms of that trauma, like my intense health anxiety and obsession over diagnoses, or my frequent triggers and meltdowns. During one of our last sessions, I was really depressed, and I had found a song that I felt really described the way I was feeling, and so I played it for her, and then afterwards she kind of asked, like, well, why do you feel that represents you? And that's how a conversation from the beginning of this video actually happened. She asked about how I related to the song. I told her I felt really broken and I was really freaking out, you guys. I was having a really hard time. I was dissociating. I was crying. I was really struggling in this moment, very visibly so. And her response was to tell me that I needed a different therapist. Now, to be fair, I think it's always okay for a therapist to recognize I'm not the right person to help this person. But that conversation should be had when both parties are feeling calm, and it shouldn't be made out to be the client's fault that we weren't a good fit. When she did this, I completely froze up and shut down. We were done working together. I knew that as soon as she suggested I find a new therapist in the middle of me having a complete breakdown. There would be no emotional safety with Tina. And as a side note, I did keep our next session in order to give her a piece of my mind, tell her that how she acted was inappropriate and not okay, and that this is why I would not be seeing her anymore. And she responded by calling me a narcissist. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with having narcissistic personality disorder. It's a trauma-based disorder just like borderline, but it shouldn't be wielded as a weapon like that. I was telling her that she hurt me, and her response was to tell me that I was being narcissistic. At no point did she apologize or take any responsibility for what happened in our previous session. It was unprofessional and frankly really triggering for me because she took my health anxiety, my diagnosis obsession, and she threw it in my face. And the idea that someone could do that a professional could do that, really, really blew my mind and kind of scarred me. So that is experience number 1 with Tina. Next up, we'll move on to experience number 2 with a therapist that we'll call Sam. And this is the therapist who solidified my opinions on self-diagnosis, which is that it is not only valid, but essential for so many of us, specifically because of therapists like Sam. I was working with Sam when I started to realize kind of on my own that I might be autistic. I was very nervous to bring it up because, as I've mentioned, I have a lot of health anxiety. I think I have everything. And so I was really worried I was going to get dismissed. But eventually I found my courage and I said, hey, I have been doing some research on this. I've taken some self-assessments. It's kind of looking like I might be autistic. And Sam's response was to tell me that she actually works with a lot of neurodivergent people and she just didn't see that in me. She did no testing. She asked no questions. And I know this story doesn't have as much shock value as my first story, but it's every bit as horrible. Diagnosis is not something you see in someone. It's something you assess for, something you get curious about instead of being judgmental. I realized then and there that if this is how therapists assess for autism, then my self-diagnosis is actually far more valid than their lack of one. I took a lot more time, energy, and effort in self-diagnosing something than this therapist did in telling me I wasn't autistic. So that's horror story number 2. In horror story number 3, we're actually going to venture away from therapy and into the world of psychiatry, because it turns out therapists aren't the only mental health professionals that can suck sometimes. I saw this psychiatrist exactly once. We will call her Dr. Eloise. I saw Dr. Eloise back in the days when I still thought I had bipolar disorder, although I was constantly doubting it and questioning it. And one of the things I was hoping Dr. Eloise could help with was helping me identify what diagnosis or diagnoses I actually had. Dr. Eloise gave me a questionnaire with a lot of routine psychiatry questions, one of which being, have you tried to not be alive anymore? And I said no, because I had never done anything of that nature. And she really took that and ran with it. She told me she wasn't sure what I was so worried about, because since I hadn't tried to take a forever nap, I was actually doing a lot better than most of her clients. I didn't know how to reply to that. I didn't know how to explain that that question only asked if I had tried to do anything, which the answer was no, which I am grateful for, of course, but it didn't ask if I had thought about it. And the truth is, I had been thinking about it for years, and I was so fucking tired. So she made me feel very invalidated, but we went on to talk about my medication options, and she went on to try to prescribe me an antipsychotic. Now, I am currently on an antipsychotic and probably should have been back then. She probably was right in that I needed an antipsychotic, but she didn't take any time to explain to me that antipsychotics could be used for things other than psychosis. So I looked at this prescription and was like, but I'm not psychotic. I don't understand. Like, she told me I wasn't even that sick, and now she's prescribing me a medication that's often used for symptoms that are really, really disrupting quality of life. Like, does she think I'm sick or not? I left her office with no intention of ever coming back. The next therapy horror story I have was with a therapist that we'll call Lily. I had been working with Lily throughout most of the pandemic, and we had really been digging into my trauma, picking up on where I left off with Tina. I thought we had a really good thing going, but then I mentioned in a session that I was a life coach, and she acted totally normal, but then in our next session, she told me that we couldn't work together anymore because her and her supervisor felt that what I was doing was unethical. From their understanding, I was attending therapy, learning therapy skills, and then giving therapy to other people without calling it therapy or without having licensure of actually being a therapist. This is not what life coaches do, by the way. This is not what I was doing at all. I was in therapy for myself and for my own issues, and my life coaching was completely separate, but there was no conversation to be had. Her and her supervisor had made up their minds, and I had to go. To this day, every time I have to start with a new therapist, I immediately tell them that I'm a life coach, that this is my job, I have no intention of quitting my job, and is this a problem for them? 90% of the therapists that I've worked with since Lily have had zero problem with it. And in fact, were pretty pissed at her for treating a client that way. And that's been a little bit validating. And finally, the last therapy horror story is another psychiatrist. We will call him Dr. Jim. I had been seeing Dr. Jim for years, and I knew he was old school. Right? Everything we did was very surface level. We didn't talk about my feelings or my trauma or anything like that. We just talked about how my last couple of months were. Did I feel the medications were working? If they were, that was great. He would see me in 3 months. And if they weren't, he would try something different and he would see me in 6 weeks. And I was kind of okay with that, honestly. I had a therapist who was meeting my needs when it came to talking about personal stuff. It was kind of nice to have a professional who was just there to give me my medications and dip. But then I started to realize that I was probably autistic, despite what my therapist Sam had to say about it. And I thought my psychiatrist should probably know about this. So I told him, and he laughed at me, like full belly laugh. He told me that I absolutely, unquestionably could not be autistic, because if I was, I would be sitting there rocking back and forth and rambling about dinosaurs. And that is a direct fucking quote. I clammed up, I shut down, and I left his office, but I did keep seeing him because he was one of the only psychiatrists covered by our insurance at the time. And it sucked that it was just another person in my life who I couldn't talk about who I really was with. Just another person who felt the need to invalidate me and chose not to listen. So those are my therapy and psychiatry horror stories. I share them because I think sometimes our loved ones will recommend that we try therapy or go see a psychiatrist, thinking that these people are not people, that they are like immaculate, all-knowing beings who can help us with everything. But therapists and doctors are deeply human. human, and sometimes that means they fuck up. And starting therapy or seeing a psychiatrist can be really scary because what if you get a Dr. Eloise or a Lily? But I also want to say, what if you get a Jenny or a Dr. Nora, my current therapist and psychiatrist? Jenny knows when to push me and when to back off and leave space for who I am. And Dr. Nora is great about prescribing my medications, but she also listens when I tell her I'm having a new problem. Look, I love therapy and I don't want these stories to scare you away from it. But I also don't want you starting therapy thinking that it's going to fix you or that all therapists are perfect. Therapy is a messy process, and finding the right therapist can take a long time, let alone finding a Jenny and a Dr. Nora at the same time. But they're out there. Good helpers are out there. I hope you find yours soon, and I'll see you next week.